Hey, what's up? My name's J.M. Chaley and welcome to my channel. This week I want to talk about Irish mythology for fantasy fiction. Now, how much fantasy fiction can we think of just off the top of our heads that includes Irish mythology? If you've got Fae, if you've got She, if you've got Banshees, if you've got the Tuatha De Danann, if you've got goblins in some flavors, all this stuff that comes from Ireland is rich with folklore, and so much of it permeates fantasy fiction. Now, a lot of this stuff nowadays, thankfully, it's a wonderful time to be alive, is at our fingertips. We could almost walk into any bookstore, get a book on Irish folklore, and off you go. Tons and tons and tons of material. But there are a scant few original authors that have made that possible during the 19th century. And I have talked about this on my channel before, using folklore for your fantasy fiction. And I even did one specifically on Greek mythology, using Greek mythology for fantasy fiction. And the takeaway from that was, if you're going to use it and you want to research it, go to the source. Go read the original works by the original authors who wrote the Greek myths. There's lots of people that regurgitate mythology these days, but there's a very short list of the original authors. Now, in the case of Irish mythology, so much of it was oral. They didn't write things down per se. They did have a written language, and the script was called Ogham script. And that script looked like a bunch of lines. And depending on which ways the slashes were going and how many slashes were pointing this way or that way, actually it would be this way and that way, I think, told you which phonetic sound the series of slashes made. And they would carve these things into wood or stone, and seldom did they really take ink and put them down, because they didn't really have that in ancient Ireland. They were mostly carving the language for those people that were literate. So it was a very finite amount of people that really spent the time to write stuff down, as it were. So all of their folk tales and stories and legends and whatnot were oral. But then Christianity came to Ireland, and for better or for worse, what happened was a lot of these monks came in and they started writing things down. Now, what they did was they took the original Irish stories and put a little slant on it. So now the gods of Ireland that were worshipped by the Druids and the ancient Irish were no longer gods. They were heroes who worshipped, Jesus Christ and God, the Christian God, right? So the Tuatha De Danann were no longer gods. They were heroes, Christian heroes. Cuchulainn became a Christian hero. King Arthur, even though he wasn't wholly an Irish, this is more of a British kind of Celtic tale. All the Arthurian legends became very Christian after the monks kind of got their hands on the language. And why did they do this? Well, they didn't invent this tactic. It was pretty smart. The Romans did it too. When the Romans rolled into Gaul and other Celtic countries, they didn't just say, hey, boom, you're going to worship Jupiter now. These are the Olympians. You're going to worship these Olympians now. What they did was they said, no. All your religious stuff is real. Hey, you know that goddess of the sacred groves that you worship, Nematona? Well, she's actually Victoria, the goddess of victory. The Greeks called her Nike, but we call her Victoria. So you're not going to call her Nematona anymore. You're going to call her Nematona Victoria. That's her full name. So it's the same person. You just got to worship the Olympians now. And it's easier to roll your religion into a group of people if you don't completely tell them, stop worshiping your gods. Stop telling these stories. Stop doing this. Stop caring about this. That's why you see a lot of Christian stuff co-opting existing folklore. There's a reason the Christians have Christmas trees, and there's a reason Christians have Yuletide and Easter and Halloween. These all sort of conveniently abut things like solstice and Samhain and Easter. I don't know how to, Ishtar, the worship of Ishtar and the Easter thing. You've all heard the story, right? I don't have to go into it. But they did the same thing in Ireland. Basically, the conquered people were getting the influx of the new religion, and it was rolled out in a way that was more digestible, more palatable, right? They weren't saying, oh, no, all this stuff is fake and you're a heathen. They said, no, this is real, but it's Christian. Did you know? Most of these stories were sort of received by the monks and then repeated back to the people and said, no, this is what it's like. And they continued these stories orally. And as the centuries moved onward, less and less people started talking about, the old Irish tales of the Tuatha De Danann and the She and the Fae and all this kind of stuff. And the more they started talking about the Gospels and all this kind of stuff from the Bibles. But the stories still persisted in small pockets of Ireland. And certain historians, folklorists, recorded those stories. And that's why today they're not lost and they're very accessible and common to us, that we can pull our research for as authors and write our fantasy fiction from this folklore. So without further ado, I want to get into a few of the most prominent authors. If you were going to do your research on Irish mythology and say, hey, I want to put Fae in my book, I want to put She in my book, Banshees in my book, Tuatha De Danann in my book, and you want to do a little bit of research and get your feet wet and really dig into the original tales of the Irish, this is where you want to start. And I want to come right out of the gates with one of the biggest names in Irish folklore, and that is Lady Gregory. Now, Lady Gregory was born in 1852, and she was a thespian, she was a playwright, she was a historian, she was a folklorist, and she was instrumental, along with other renowned authors, Irish authors like William Butler Yeats and others, to revive Irish literature and bring it more into the prominence. For the longest time, the popular stuff to read was coming in from Britain and other places in Europe, and she was one of the instrumental people to really bring back Irish literature and Irish authors and Irish folktales and say, no, this is the stuff that we created, the stuff that we wrote, and this is the stuff that we should be passionate about. It is our history, it is our folklore, and this is exciting stuff. She is renowned for writing tomes of the Irish hero Cuchulainn and all his deeds, and he was a great Irish warrior. Stories and stories and stories abound of this guy. And she has at least a couple of volumes of books on just Cuchulainn's tale alone. But one of the most famous works that she ever did was Gods and Fighting Men. This book, if the Irish had a religion that had a book like the Bible, this might be one of the considerations for that book. This has everything. This has Fae. It has the Tuatha De Danann. This has all the history, the fight with the Fomori, and all the stuff with Dagda, and it has all the Fae and the Banshees and the She and all the creatures and weird critters and stuff like this, all the stuff that I love to do creature spotlights on. It's all in this book. This book is the history. It is the defining folklore tome, Gods and Fighting Men by Lady Gregory. This is where I wanted to kind of start and kick this off. If you are a fan of Irish folklore, if you want to research Irish mythology, I highly recommend this book. This is almost required reading for someone who wants to learn this history and this mythology. But now that I've gushed over Lady Gregory, I have to move on to the next author, amazing author, who came before Lady Gregory, and who, if not for Lady Gregory may not have been able to compile quite everything she had. And this person was Lady Jane Wilde. Lady Jane Wilde was born in 1821, and if you guessed it, last name Wilde, she happened to be the mother of Oscar Wilde, who's another famous Irish writer. Lady Jane Wilde was a folklorist, and she famously wrote a book called Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland. This book, I sprung for the really fancy copy with the... I actually bought this in Ireland. I'm sure I could have bought it anywhere, but the idea that I bought it in Ireland, somehow I feel like it's enchanted, and I have knowledge just by holding it. This book is, again, the definitive volume, the definitive tome. I would say this and Gods and Fighting Men are almost required reading. It needs to be on your bookshelf if you want to get into Irish mythology, Irish folklore. This is it. This book is fantastic, and I highly recommend it. I mean, you could read it cover to cover. It reads like a story, or a compendium of stories. Or, it's a great reference if you want to flip through it and say, hey, I need to read up on, the Morrigan and find out what's going on with her. What's her deal? Boop, boop, boop. There it is. Gods and Fighting Men, same kind of deal. Irish Superstitions, Mystic... God, this is a mouthful of a title. Ancient Legends, Mystic Charms, and Superstitions of Ireland. That's the title. These two books together, I mean, I can't recommend them enough. These are your Bible of Irish mythology. Moving on, I want to talk about Patrick Weston Joyce. Patrick Weston Joyce was born in 1827. And although not strictly a folklorist, he was a historian and an author. But his writings were mostly about sort of nonfiction stuff and reference stuff. Now, his book was called The Origin and History of Irish Names and Places. This is a 3-volume set. I'm holding volume 2 in my hands. These go for about $60 a pop. I'm not sure why. Maybe they're rare, or I don't know that they're out of print. I probably got ripped off because I bought it on Amazon like a fool. But most of this stuff goes over literally what you'd think about when you think of the title, The Origin of Names and History. Origin and History of Irish Names and Places. These titles are killing me. So the books kind of talk about what you'd expect with a title like that. They talk about the origins of the languages, the origins of the words. He talks about the different plants that are around Ireland, the different animals and topography. He has a chapter called, in this volume, he has a chapter called Quagmires and Watery Places, where he talks about the different lakes and rivers and bogs and all this kind of stuff. But he also talks a little bit about the folklore in some of the regions. And that's where some of these real nuggets come from that weren't captured in the works of Lady Jane Wilde and Lady Gregory. These little tiny nuggets that you have to really sift through. And these are like deep cuts. You know what I mean? These are like B-sides of Irish folklore that a lot of people don't necessarily know about, or most people don't necessarily know about. But if I'm talking about Patrick Weston Joyce, I have to talk about John O'Donovan. John O'Donovan is probably the one who is responsible for the data collected that went into these 3 tomes. John O'Donovan was a topographer, he was a linguistic scholar, and he was a folklorist and a bit of a historian. So he was actually commissioned to go out into Ireland and document things as much as you possibly could, right? I think he was working for the British. The British wanted to get an idea of what was going on in Ireland, what they were all about, what was where, and all this kind of stuff. So he would write down, all this kind of stuff. The quagmires and watery places, that was his, right? Figuring out who did what kind of people were where, what clans were where, what this word meant, all this kind of stuff. Where does that road lead? And he broke it up into these letters, and each letter was these long letters, and they went by county within Ireland. But the other thing he did, it was a lot of reference, right? A lot of like topography, here's the woods, here's some grass over here, right? So each letter talked about all the features of the county, the people, the land, the animals, the plants, and all this kind of stuff. But what he went into was he found that everyone had kind of stories, folklore. And he was fascinated by this. John O'Donovan loved the folklore of it all. So even though he really wasn't there to get these old tales and myths, he recorded them. He'd roll into a town and say, he'd talk about all the different like natural features of the land and the area. But then he'd say, hey, got any stories? Got any cool stories for me? And he'd write those down too. Now, all these letters were eventually published, and you can find them online. I think they're out there somewhere. You may have to get really creative with how you find them, and they're broken up by county. So you'd have to really do your research and figure out what county you're looking for and what was where. And the compendiums of those notes or those letters are out of print. I haven't been able to secure any myself, but I have found some of the text from them online. But most of the material that he put into his letters are in these volumes from Patrick, Weston, Joyce, the 3 volumes. But I don't know that he captured everything. So, for example, when I went into to start writing some of the stuff with The Unlife of Lisa Cooper, and I wanted to do vampire folklore, I researched this King Avertok, and I've talked about him in other videos I've done, who was apparently cursed by the old gods and drank blood, and he kept coming back from the dead, and blah, 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 right? That came from an old tale recorded by John O'Donovan from Londonderry County in the 1800s. And it only exists in that tome. And, it's not in the Lady Gregory book, it's not in the Lady Jane Wilde book, right? These are these old tales that seeped through the cracks a little bit. So if you really want to get into some deep, maybe almost forgotten, it is recorded, so it's not completely forgotten, but almost forgotten Irish folklore, check out John O'Donovan, see if you can find some of his letters. You're going to go through a lot of reading about topography and stuff like that. You may have to slog through it unless you find it interesting. Or you could try your hand at the Patrick Weston Joyce 3-volume set. But I wanted to throw that in there just because that's some really cool, obscure Irish mythology. So that about wraps it up. A bunch of Irish authors. If you want to write about Irish folklore in your fantasy fiction, I definitely recommend reading it, because we tend to sort of homogenize everything now. It's kind of like everything's gelled together. Everyone's idea of what a fairy is and who the Tuatha De Danann were are kind of gelled together from so many authors that have put their own spin on it or regurgitated the words of someone else. If you go back to the original source and start at the beginning, then you can truly make it your own based on the original folklore and the original words captured by people that lived hundreds of years ago. And I think that's really cool. So, yeah, Irish mythology, Irish folklore. Love it, love it, love it. If you liked this video, if you found it helpful, please give it a like. And as always, please subscribe. I post most Thursdays. And you can find me on Facebook, Twitter, Instagram, TikTok, and Threads. Check out The Unlife of Lisa Cooper, coming out October 6th. Lots of great vampire stuff in that. 40 episodes from my Kindle Vella series that have been compiled into a novel format that you can get in paperback, hardback, or ebook. And that is coming out October 6th, wherever books are sold. Check out jmchaley.com to see what else is cooking, and send me a message. Click on Contact Me and say hello. Let's keep in touch. All right, thanks for watching. I'll see you next time.